Jen, naively convinced that his sister could handle things on her own, had decided to waste some of his time helping Sean. Fei was on patrol duty and, according to our protagonist, that meant he had to wander aimlessly around the city without a specific destination. He basically did not have to work, unlike virtually everyone else in that place. This was almost a unique case. Every street was filled with people going to work or returning home. People only left their homes to go to work because, according to the pragmatic belief of the central government, the population should spend as little time as possible outside their homes to avoid unnecessary complications. They enacted laws that discouraged residents from spending time outdoors. In particular, the most important law in this regard was undoubtedly the night curfew law, which prevented any unauthorized citizen from leaving their home during the night hours. Other less important laws prohibited any kind of party, inviting more than one person into one's home, keeping them there even during the night hours, and leaving the city without authorization. Every street, road, and public place in the city was constantly monitored by at least one camera, and this had a certain effect on the population, so much so that individuals avoided being outside, fearing that any wrong action would cost them dearly, and leading them to take refuge in their homes. Jen decided to meet Sean while he was walking home. However, he did not want his sister to see him out and about with the brat who had caused her so much embarrassment, so he decided to take an alternative route that would prevent the two from meeting in any way. Finally, he saw the red-haired boy calmly walking on the other side of the sidewalk in the distance. He tried to approach him. At some point, he noticed that he had stopped to look at something on the sidewalk, but he couldn't figure out what it was. He continued to approach until he reached him. "Hello," he said, without receiving any response. "Hello," he said again, but with more emphasis.
"Oh, hello. Mr. Jen,"
the boy said in his usual flat and apathetic tone, without taking his eyes off what he was observing.
"Don't call me mister. I'm still young. I've told you so many times. It's annoying. What are you looking at?"
"Ants."
"Ah, I see."
A group of ants had found their home in a crack on the side of the sidewalk. They were continuously coming in and out of the hole, like tireless workers who were constantly striving to do their duty.
"I was thinking,"
continued Jen.
"it's been almost a month since you decided to stick with me. When are you going to leave me alone?"
"Oh, has it been almost a month since you saved me from that monster?"
Sean replied, without taking his eyes off the ants.
"Time flies."
"Yeah, too bad I didn't realize then that the real monster wasn't the one I killed, but the one I saved. You're such a burden,"
Jen said, realizing too late that he may have made a joke that could have hurt his feelings.
"I remember the first time I introduced myself to your house. You slammed the door in my face, literally."
"Yeah, and you stood outside the door for 2 hours doing nothing. That's when you convinced me to help you,"
Hoffman said, then thinking to himself, and I wanted to make sure Jennifer didn't notice anything. He noticed that Sean was not paying too much attention to his words and was more interested in the ants. Pointing at the latter with his finger, our protagonist said,
"Why are you so interested in that?"
"Mr. Jen, can I ask you a question?"
"Don't call me." "Never mind. Go ahead."
"Don't ants resemble people? They work, live in groups, and have their own house."
The question surprised our protagonist a little.
"Since when do you ask these kinds of questions?" "Anyway, to answer to your question, it is true that their organization is similar to ours, but, like all other animals, they are not endowed with reason. They do not ask themselves whether what they do is morally right or whether it can be done in another way, they just do it. Humans, on the other hand, are capable and willing to improve their situation, which is why they propose constant changes to their lives to make them more enjoyable to live. They also have a great ability to organize themselves. However, every man by nature considers only his interests, and these changes can also be harmful to others. This has led to wars and the creation of various political systems, such as absolute monarchy, which protected the interests of those in power, and democracy, which instead protected the interests of everyone. More or less, have you understood what I said?
"I understood everything, Mr. Jen."
Jen was impressed by the boy. He knew he was smarter than the average, but considering his age, he did not believe he could understand such a speech. He also noticed that he did not take his eyes off the ant nest.
Mr. Jen, I have another question.
Go ahead.
Why do queen ants do nothing and let everyone else do the work? Isn't that unfair?
Hoffman let out a smile.
No, Sean, queen ants are necessary for the ant nest to function. Similarly, in the human social system, if there were no leader, we would live in anarchy.
And anarchy is a negative thing. They say it is, at school.
Some have posed this question. In the last 2 centuries it was hypothesized that we could live without any type of political structure, leaving people to live without any leader. However, with the absence of someone making decisions, a poor political and social organization would have resulted, which would have led to an incredible inefficiency of any type of structure and would have significantly worsened the daily lifestyle of any individual. We cannot all be equal, Sean. There must be someone more important who takes responsibility for leadership and makes decisions on our behalf. Sacrificing a bit of justice to make the system more effective.
So it's right that some people have more privileges than others.
Yes. To be fair, in politics right or wrong are difficult to separate. The question is only divided and decided by subjective points of view.
Jen loved to talk about philosophy and politics. Those were topics that intrigued him, amused him, and stimulated him. Furthermore, he could boast of having read texts that were little or not at all widespread in the city, as in the numerous missions outside the walls. He had often had works by wise people of the past in his hands, some of which were declared illegal and censored because they went against the city's creed itself. Discussions on deep topics were an excellent means of escaping from the boredom that oppressed his life. Unfortunately for him, not everyone was willing to engage in this type of dialogue, and he often found himself discussing only with himself inside his head. He often tried to touch on these topics in conversations with Jennifer, but she couldn't keep up, more out of disinterest than anything else. The fact that Sean was so interested in these themes could only please our protagonist. However, he did not understand how far Sean was able to follow him. The only way to find out was to try. Sean suddenly diverted his gaze from the ants to turn it towards our protagonist.
Mr. Jen, yesterday I confessed my love to a girl, but I think I did something wrong. She immediately rejected me, and today I ended up ruining her day.
At this point Jen, who in his head was continuing his debate of ideas, suddenly returned to earth.
You ruined her day. What did you do, and why is your face all red?
She's angry because everyone hates her. But I don't.
What do you mean? Can you please be less vague, perhaps?
She's angry because everyone was making fun of her.
For fuck's sake, can you formulate more than one sentence in a single answer?
She used her powers and messed up the gym. The teacher got mad and hit her. Oh, she also fought with Bennett, a friend of hers, I think, because she insulted her and said nasty things to her.
I have to go home.
Okay, Mr. Jen.
Jen, just before leaving, remembered that he had not yet apologized for the bad advice he had given, which in his opinion was the cause of this situation.
Wait, do you live nearby? I'll walk you home. I need to talk to you about something.
Sean nodded in approval, and the two started walking side by side.
I wanted to apologize for what happened. This whole mess was my fault. All this happened because of my stupid advice. Please try not to take what I say in the future too seriously.
It's not your fault, Mr. Jen. I've been wanting to confess my love for her for months. I'm sorry if I caused discomfort to her, but now that she said no, I won't bother her anymore, I swear.
At this point, Jen decided to get something off his chest.
Jennifer is my sister,
he said, in a dry tone, without looking him in the eyes.
Oh. Jennifer Hoffman is your sister.
That's what I said. My last name is Hoffman. I'm Jen Hoffman. I hope you haven't heard my name before.
Honestly, no.
Good.
What a strange coincidence.
Don't tell me.
After this response, there were a few moments of silence accompanied by a slight embarrassment as the two continued walking.
I have one more question, Mr. Hoffman.
Sorry, no. I have to go home. Jennifer will be in tears.
But Sean completely ignored his mentor's words.
Is it normal not to be able to feel emotions like others do?
What do you mean?
I feel like something is missing in me. I feel like I'm not living like others do. I see them cry, laugh, get angry, but I can't. I can't feel anything, I just can't feel anything, it's frustrating. I wish I could cry, get angry, joke, but I feel like I'm just built differently, I can't do it.
Many people are apathetic. It's not an unsolvable problem. Try to do what makes you happier, the apathy will fade away.
I don't know what would make me happy.
You're a young boy, you'll have time to find out. At least, I hope so.
But in the meantime, what do I do?
I don't know how to help you, Sean. Why did you confess to my sister if you feel nothing?
I liked having her around, just seeing her in class with me. It was something different, something that made me happy. But I ruined everything.
You didn't ruin anything.
Jen replied confidently, trying to reassure him. At this point Hoffman tried to investigate more deeply, using his knowledge from old psychiatry lectures, trying to understand if this apathy was the origin of his total passivity.
What do you feel when they insult you or they raise their hands against you?
Nothing. I haven't felt ashamed for years now. I don't care what my classmates think of me, I only cared about Jennifer. But you also interest me, Mr. Hoffman. You make me feel more alive by being close to you. You're something different from normality.
Jen had just realized that the boy's apathy seemed to go well beyond commonly understood limits. Although apathy was a very common condition in the city, Sean was a special case. It seemed that he did not feel any emotions at all. How do you live without emotions? This seemed to explain all the bizarre behaviors of the boy. He had no friends, because he did not desire them and was not capable of having them. How do you create a friendship without empathy? They made fun of him at school, but he didn't care because he was not capable of feeling shame. He was the true couldn't care less guy. In comparison, Jen was a beginner. He had made the big mistake of thinking that Sean was the usual suffering loser, just like Jen was at his age. A banal error of identifying himself with the condition of someone else. No, Sean was different. He was a unique case. He went beyond social reputation. He wanted to understand how far this apathy went and its origin and nature. He knew that it was not the apathy of a psychopath, otherwise, he would have behaved in a much more violent and reckless manner, not being able to feel guilt or fear. What am I doing? I have to go help my sister, thought Jen, remembering that she couldn't waste any more time and had to go back home.
Why are all those roads closed?
Asked Jen.
Oh.
Sean replied.
They closed a dozen blocks for some works. I don't know of what kind. They even evacuated the residents.
Once they forced me to leave my house for renovations on my building. These shacks are falling apart, they need constant restructuring.
To get home we have to go the other way.
I'm in a hurry.
I can go home alone, Mr. Hoffman.
No, we need to talk. I don't want what happened yesterday to happen again, then I'll go back to my sister.
Then we have to go the other way.
No, let's go through the closed road. I'm a member of the high-level macro section. I can pass without any trouble.
No.
Now what's the matter? Are you afraid? 5 minutes ago, you didn't even know what emotions were.
No, I feel nothing, Mr. Hoffman, but something tells me it's not safe.
So, was he afraid or not? Did he feel emotions or not? Instead of becoming clearer, the puzzle became more complex. If it had been another time, he would have certainly wasted time trying to analyze the issue better, but now he certainly couldn't spend all this time on him.
Listen, Sean, in the city, there's an unwritten rule that the higher you are in the social pyramid, the less you are affected by the law. In this place, the law is not equal for everyone, and since I'm rather high up in this pyramid, I can afford to do things that would otherwise be illegal.
And isn't that a bit unfair?
No, the law cannot be equal for everyone in my opinion, but now shut up and walk.
The closed road was delimited by yellow plastic ribbons, and numerous signs indicated that there were works in progress and ordered not to cross the ribbons. Jen passed first under them, followed by a hesitant Sean. Passers-by didn't pay too much attention to what was happening because they noticed the red band on his arm and were convinced he was authorized to do what he was doing. The road that opened up in front of them was deserted, while the surrounding buildings were surrounded by numerous external scaffolding typical of renovations, while a good number of builders were at work, although no machines seemed to be in use. Perhaps some builders were on lunch break. Jen continued to talk to Sean, trying to give him more advice on how to deal with school life, this time more carefully, and how not to be the class's favorite target. Among other things, he suggested he should start doing push-ups, as his body was too small and frail in his opinion. As they went on, Jen continued to speed up and become hastier. He wanted to get back home to his sister. After what had happened, he was aware that his sister had inevitably been traumatized by it. Sean tried to keep up, but Hoffman was too fast, forcing the latter to slow down. Numerous builders were working here and there. The closed area seemed to be larger than Jen thought. A piece of one of the buildings in the area had collapsed, and the competent authorities had decided to renovate all the surrounding buildings to prevent it from happening again. Probably someone had even died, considering how massive the intervention was. It wasn't the first time it had happened though. After turning a corner, the two glimpsed a group of 4 or 5 people whose members seemed to be having a nice talk. They were dressed in the usual dark blue shirt with a white collar.
Who are they?
Asked Sean.
Other builders.
I doubt it.
Replied Jen.
The others all wore yellow helmets and reflective vests. They don't. If they actually are builders, they are breaking the law by not wearing them. But builders know that well.
Jen then approached the group, suspicious.
Good morning.
He said, getting their attention.
I don't think you're builders. Show me your identification and authorization to be here.
They started looking at him with a perplexed look, as if he was speaking another language, but at the same time aggressively. Jen, even more suspicious, quickly touched the back of one of the builders. Although he was touching a shirt, at least apparently, to the touch it seemed that he was in contact with very rough skin, almost like that of an insect.
You have no idea what I said, do you?
After a few seconds of complete immobility, Jen punched one of them in the face, decapitating them immediately and brutally. Although Sean, from a distance, was initially shocked by what he had seen, he immediately noticed that the blood spilled from the dead one's body was not red, but dark green. The remaining 4 builders, if we still want to call them that, then showed their true nature by changing and assuming their original form. They were bipedal insect-like beings, green like crickets. But instead of hands they had pincers and had sharp teeth protruding from their mouths, while their legs were very hairy and were similar in color to a pigeon's wings. They were really ugly to look at. The others tried to attack Jen in a group, emitting animalistic noises that consisted of almost choked screams, but 2 of them were killed with a single punch, and the others with the magnum point for bullets that Jen had quickly pulled out of his jacket. After that, our protagonist took a handkerchief from one of his pockets and cleaned his hands and face from the enemy's blood. Meanwhile, all the builders and Sean himself were watching him from a distance, to say the least astonished.
Are you okay?
Said Sean, trembling, as he slowly tried to reach Jen.
Yes, no problem.
What were these creatures?
Shapeshifters. They snuck in here assuming human form. Although they can copy the appearance of a man, they cannot change the composition of their skin and cannot imitate human language. The problem is that usually these things build nests, usually in abandoned or unused buildings.
Jen then looked around. He knew he couldn't just brush it off and leave. Firstly, because the central government would not look kindly on it, and secondly, because the lives of these builders could be in danger.
They are not usually aggressive,
said Jen.
But they are carnivorous creatures and, even though they usually settle for scraps they find in small animals, they often attack humans as well, especially if they are near their nest. I think they've built one nearby.
What do you want to do?
Honestly, Hoffman didn't know. Although he knew that the ideal procedure would be to warn the central government and proceed with an organized evacuation, preparing search operations and perhaps an entire extermination thoroughly, he also knew that it would take several hours at best. He wanted to go home and do it quickly, for Jennifer.
I'll quickly take care of it,
said Jen.
Wait for me here, I'm sure their nest is in this apartment.
He continued, indicating the building in front of which those 5 creatures were standing.
I don't think it's a good idea. Can I leave?
Said Sean.
I'd rather you stay close. Think about it, if you leave, there's a risk that someone might stop you because, effectively, you're in an area where you're not authorized to pass. Also, if I know you're nearby, if you feel like calling for help, I'll come to you immediately.
I don't like this plan.
Jen didn't pay much attention to the boy's words and began searching for something in his pockets. He then took a strange stick that Sean couldn't identify, divided into pieces that our protagonist quickly assembled.
Take this,
said Jen, handing him a flute.
If you blow into it, it makes such a loud noise that you could hear it from the fricking moon.
Mr. Hoffman.
What now?
Why do you have such a strange object in one of your pockets?
At this point, Jen let out an embarrassed smile and began nervously scratching the back of his neck. He seemed caught off guard and completely disoriented. This question had put him in more difficulty than the previous creatures.
Well, wait a sec, why don't you explain why you always call me Mr. Hoffman instead? You seem retarded. How many times do I have to tell you? I am still young. 31 years aren't that many. Let's just finish this quickly.
Jen then entered that apartment. Sean remained motionless, waiting with a blank stare for our protagonist's return. Meanwhile, the builders, who had remained to watch the entire scene with perplexity, fear, and had not been able to hear any of Jen's words, resumed their work convinced that whatever the problem was, it would be solved by the superhuman of the central government. It didn't even take a minute for Sean to begin hearing non-human screams and gunshots coming from inside the building. This immediately put everyone on guard. It seemed quite obvious that Jen was wreaking havoc. After a few minutes, the gunfire ceased, and the apartment began to tremble strongly, as if something was moving it from the inside. The tremors were so violent that a micro-earthquake was created in the immediate surrounding area. Even the screams of the creatures could no longer be heard. The situation was suspicious, even Sean could tell. However, no one even remotely had the thought of going inside to check. 7 minutes had passed since Jen entered, and now for a few seconds, there was a deafening silence. This reassured Sean. It meant that his master had completed the operation. However, while the red-haired boy became increasingly convinced that things had gone well, his eyes allowed him to see a scene that he could not even imagine. A deafening noise erupted in the air and caught everybody's attention. Jen had just been thrown out of the building from the 13th and penultimate floor. He was thrown through the wall and broke it, creating a huge hole. Then, he slammed his back against the walls of the building across the street, causing parts of it to collapse along with the entire scaffolding and restructuring works. That building was split in two. Each floor and its internal dwellings could easily be seen from the outside. Jen was buried under the enormous heap of debris that had been deposited there. Fortunately, no builders were working in that building. A thunderous roar came from the palace from which Jen had been thrown. From the hole created by the launch of his body, a huge being, similar to those that appeared before, but much bigger and stronger, seemed to declare its existence to that world and to ensure anyone who could see it that it was the one who had swept away a high-level superhuman with such violence. It could only be the Queen of Shapeshifters. She dropped to the ground, landing a few meters from Sean, creating cracks in the asphalt of the road. He, in the grip of terror, dropped the flute that had been given to him by Jen. He couldn't move a muscle. Perhaps this was what others called fear.
Sean, run!
Someone shouted from behind. It was Jen, who was slowly emerging from the rubble. But he didn't even have time to finish the sentence before the creature, with a claw strike, broke Sean's leg. The boy didn't even react, given the speed of the strike, and shortly after, when a piercing pain began to pervade his young leg, he emitted a painful scream of terror that could have made even the coldest of men shiver. Jen himself was petrified. The creature seemed to be strongly attracted to the boy. Perhaps it wanted to eat him, or worse. Our protagonist made a leap, and managed to free himself from the rubble, finding himself just a few meters from his powerful enemy. He was breathing heavily and a strong pain struck his chest. It didn't take long for him to realize that he had broken most of his ribs, as well as some vertebrae. He took out his locator and unplugged a little pin. By doing so, his headquarters would receive the emergency signal. He knew he needed help. It was decidedly atypical for such a powerful being to be inside the walls of the city, but it was not impossible. Perhaps it had somehow slipped inside by passing through the sewers. Creatures like this were in most cases irrational beings that destroyed everything they found. It had exactly the appearance of those that appeared before, but was at least 4 meters tall and much more muscular, and had an incredibly repugnant appearance. Jen looked like a dwarf next to it, and Jen was almost 2 meters tall. But even the creature itself in its irrationality seemed impressed by Hoffman. perhaps because it didn't expect its rival to still be alive after such a blow. The being began to grunt something in an incomprehensible language. Probably what it was saying didn't even make sense. Jen, who continued to touch his ribs, tried to understand how strong his opponent was. He believed that under normal conditions he could beat him, but he didn't know if he could say the same after being injured so badly. The beast and our protagonist looked into each other's eyes for a few seconds like two predators, interested in the same prey, Sean. Jen knew he was inferior in terms of physical strength, as evidenced by how she had thrown him around like a puppet earlier, but he could still rely on his agility to have a good chance of achieving decent results. He reminded himself insistently that his priority was not to kill the creature, but to save Sean. After a moment of stalemate, the creature began to run quickly and fiercely towards our protagonist. It looked like a train about to crash at full speed. In fact, it seemed to weigh at least half a ton, considering the height and enormous physique it possessed. However, Jen himself was no slouch, and despite his injuries, with a huge leap, he managed to jump over the creature and he started shooting with the two trusted Colt M1911s he had just drawn, one of which was silver and the other black. Despite emptying two entire magazines, hitting it in the head with almost all the bullets, the attack proved to be not very effective. In fact, it seemed to have had no effect at all. Not that it particularly surprised our protagonist. Actually, he was hoping to hit some weak spot with a bit of luck. The creature then turned around again and began to run towards him once more. Hoffman grabbed Sean and, holding the boy with one hand, slid under the creature's legs, then fled in the direction they had come from. Sean held onto his back, clasping his mentor's body with his slender arms. Jen could feel his terror by touch. His whole little body trembled like leaves, and he looked like a small defenseless puppy. He didn't say a word and stared blankly into nothingness. Ironic, Jen thought, since just a few seconds ago he was talking to him about his total apathy. But his train of thought was soon interrupted as the mutant queen, contrary to our protagonist's expectations, seemed to be much faster than he expected, reaching the two of them despite Jen traveling at almost 80 kilometers per hour. Hoffman didn't even have time to drop Sean to the ground before that beast hit him with a claw under the stomach, making him fly and slamming him against a wall at the end of a dead-end alley. It took only 2 seconds to cover over 100 meters. The wall on which he had been thrown collapsed, along with part of the building it was attached to, but fortunately, most of the structure held up. It seemed to have been hit by a cannonball. The impact was incredibly violent. Jen tried to protect Sean throughout the entire process, sustaining numerous fractures, a head trauma, and a dislocated shoulder, but at least the boy, though even more stunned, did not seem to be further injured, not in a serious way at least. As for Hoffman, the most painful area was undoubtedly his chest. Other ribs seemed to have broken, and he also suspected that one of them had punctured a lung, since he had great difficulty breathing. With one hand he continued to touch his chest, while with the other he gripped the Magnum 44, his longtime companion of many adventures.
Sean. I'm not sure I can defeat it. If you have the chance, run for your life, if you can.
Sean, crying from the pain, nodded to indicate he understood. With a quick movement, Jen tried to put his dislocated shoulder back into its place. Every word was painful and difficult to pronounce, like a punch in the stomach, and even breathing was becoming torture. It had been a long time since he had encountered an enemy this strong. The Queen of Shapeshifters didn't just stand there and watch. Slowly approaching, she decided to change her strategy and attack her opponent slowly. Jen decided to take advantage of the moment of truce to launch a quick assault. After running towards her, he made another huge leap and tried to land, with the intention of hitting her with all his strength on the face with both feet. But the queen was able to catch one of his legs with a claw, causing compound fractures of the tibia and fibula simply by tightening her grip, then throwing him back about 15 meters. The pain was, contrary to what one might think, more intense in the badly injured area of the ribs than in the leg. At this point, Jen felt completely out of breath and had the sensation of being impaled in the torso by dozens of swords. A normal person with such injuries would have been dead by now. He lay on the ground with eyes that seemed to emit the scream his mouth was unable to make due to lack of air. It was so painful that he couldn't move. This allowed the beast to approach, calmly and almost arrogantly. Her behavior was very human-like in a strange way. Her intentions seemed to scream very clearly at him, "Now I'm going to crush you." It wasn't the most charismatic of statements, but it was still terrifying. She tried to finish our protagonist with a strike from her claw, but he suddenly, just before being touched, stood up with lightning speed and, pulling out a combat knife from his jacket, almost as big as a sword, with a titanium alloy blade, stabbed the creature's neck, almost decapitating her. After this attack, she fell lifeless to the ground, causing a loud thud. Jen, in pain, limped back to Sean. He was aware that because of his idea, the boy was about to lose his life. His breaths were becoming more and more painful and labored, and as he walked, he continued to emit choked cries of pain. He hoped someone outside the alley would hear him and come to his aid. "Don't worry, Sean, it's over," he said, trying to reassure the boy. He felt a strong sense of shame towards himself, convinced that after that day, Sean would never want to see him again. He was an adult man. He couldn't afford to make another mistake like this. Next time, he would surely be punished. Today, however, he had been kissed by luck. Or at least it seemed so. In fact, about a minute after suffering what seemed a mortal blow, the creature rose again, with its neck half slashed, and turned towards Hoffman, looking at him with a fierce and angry gaze, but almost terrified as well. She stuttered something again and made some strange noises, and then started running towards him again, while the knife was still lodged in her neck. This time Jen didn't let himself be caught off guard and, taking his modified Magnum 44, a weapon with devastating power, he shot almost all the bullets he had in her face. Each shot emitted a deafening noise. They sounded like cannon shots. Sean had to cover his ears to protect his eardrums. The bullets caused further wounds to the creature's body, but the shots failed to stop her. Jen then tried again to avoid the direct impact with another jump, but realized a fraction of a second too late that this move was frankly too predictable. And he was right. The queen caught him in midair with a claw, taking one of his legs. She squeezed the grip with all her strength and broke it. She then began to slam Jen against the walls of the buildings and the ground, without letting him go, and this was massacring him. The mortal wounds and the pain were increasing tremendously. She was killing him with incredible cruelty. He absolutely had to do something, but the enormous violence of the impacts allowed him no movement. He felt his life slipping away from his body little by little, as if his soul was leaving him to go to a better place, but he thought it was foolish to believe in heaven. In an instant, he saw his life pass before him. His childhood, adolescence, family. Was it really possible that it would end so suddenly? He knew that it is difficult to die with dignity or with a purpose, but did it have to end in a moment like this? None of us realizes how life can end in an instant, because if we did we would constantly live in fear of losing it. But this made Jen realize how meaningless life is and how the universe doesn't care about us. Wrapped in sadness, he was about to let go, when he remembered something. He couldn't afford to die. Jennifer needed him. If he died, not only would his life end, but he would ruin the girl's life. What would happen to her if he died? She wouldn't recover from such a trauma. Not to mention Sean, what cruelty would befall that poor boy. He could not allow this to happen. Jen gathered all the energy he had left in his body to try and escape the grip of the queen with one last desperate attempt. He flung his body towards the creature's neck and managed to retrieve the knife that was still stuck in it. However, he knew that he wouldn't be able to harm her if he remained in her grasp. He needed to free himself, but the creature continued to hold onto his ankle with all her might. The only solution that came to his mind at that moment was perhaps not the most efficient, but he didn't think twice. He took the knife and, with a precise strike, he amputated his foot and part of his calf, subsequently falling to the ground. The beast, which had remained confused with only the amputated part of Jen's leg between her claws, tried to understand what was happening. Jen took advantage of her momentary hesitation to throw himself with all the strength he had left towards the opponent's heart, stabbing it with the knife so deeply that he himself entered the creature and then emerged from its back. After this attack, the lifeless body of the creature fell to the ground once again, emitting a huge thud. Shortly thereafter, our protagonist, having freed himself from his opponent's body, also collapsed to the ground, exhausted from the effort and the wounds. He had won again, but it was not a victory like all the others. It was tasteless. He felt guilty because his irresponsibility was about to cost Sean's life and ruin Jennifer's life. He turned to look for the boy, who was still there in tears. Shortly afterwards, Sean noticed that Jen was staring at him and said,
"Mr. Hoffman, the pain was too much, I couldn't move."
It's okay, it's all my fault, I'm sorry Sean.
Tears continued to flow from Sean's eyes, and as he continued to touch his injured leg, he said, while trembling,
"Mr. Hoffman, this is my first time, I finally understand what terror is, now, I never want to experience this thing ever again."
I'm sorry Sean, I'm sorry.
There was definitely something wrong with the boy. It seemed that the emotions he was feeling were literally about to make him implode. He had his eyes wide open unnaturally, while he continued to cry and kept his mouth semi-open while he looked traumatized at his leg bent unnaturally. To make matters worse, Jen noticed looking at the floor that a puddle of blood was forming from the wound of his amputated foot. He absolutely had to treat the wound, or he risked worsening his condition. As he was thinking about how to heal, something horrible happened, something that froze the hearts of both of them. The creature slowly began to move, whimpering from the wounds. Gradually, to the incredulous eyes of the two, she stood up and removed that little knife from her chest, throwing it to the ground. She was literally standing with a huge hole in her chest, through which one could see the other side. Jen finally understood the strength of his opponent. She had advanced regenerative abilities that allowed her to heal even the worst wounds. It was not just a danger to the two of them, but to the entire neighborhood. Jen realized that she could even kill a member of the master-level macro sections. But it was not the first time he had encountered someone with such power, and now he knew how to kill her. He had to damage her brain, the only part that, in almost all cases, could not be repaired. He was overcome with dismay when he realized that, given its condition, it would not be an easy task. As time passed and the creature remained momentarily still, moaning from its wounds, Jen began to feel a terrible sensation. Panic. It was more than justified, since he had realized that no matter how much determination or effort he would put in, he had no chance of winning. The only thing he could do was hope, but he knew perfectly well that hope was nothing but the strength of the weak. Hope for what? A miracle. Perhaps, someone must have heard the screams coming from the alley. Someone must have perceived the signal of help he had sent. Was it possible that no help had arrived? He thought about the consequences of his death, he thought about his sisters, about Sean, who had the only real misfortune in his life of meeting an irresponsible dickhead like him. He knew it was his fault. He knew perfectly well it was all his fault. He had never been able to give a purpose to his life, and now look at the results. Killed by a nameless creature along with a boy who had just discovered what terror is. If the creature hadn't killed him, the guilt would surely have done it. He would never have forgotten such a stupid move. At some point, the queen shapeshifter stopped whimpering. Its wounds had healed. Jen's heart was pounding, he felt as if someone were choking him, and he also heard Sean's cries of fear. Of course, he couldn't escape. He was without a foot, although the path behind him led back in the direction they had come from. He stood up, putting all his weight on his remaining foot. Fear had filled him with so much adrenaline that he could barely feel the pain. He knew that alley would be his tomb, he screamed, going beyond the strength that remained to him.
Sean, win over the pain and escape.
Having said that, he tried to sacrifice his life to give Sean time to escape, but a few moments later, the creature caught him by the neck with a claw, depriving him of air. After being in this state for 5 long minutes, Jen's head turned purple, he was dying of suffocation. But the creature suddenly loosened her grip, maintaining a look that seemed to say, You won't die without suffering." She then threw him violently to the ground, creating cracks in the floor and breaking more of his vertebrae. The creature then placed her enormous foot on the protagonist's left shoulder and began to pull his left arm with her claw. This caused him inhumane pain, making him scream and almost cry from the pain, while pathetically pleading for mercy from the creature, as if she could understand him. In the end, she brutally tore his entire arm from his torso, causing him such a strong shock that he remained immobile without even breathing. A pool of blood was forming under his body, rapidly expanding. After doing this, the queen devoured the torn limb with her sharp teeth in front of his eyes, shredding it into 1,000 pieces, while the bad of the other's macrosection flew away from that hell. The beast then picked up Jen, now at the end of his life, by the neck, lifting him up, and then throwing him back to the ground and leaving him there. Even a being like that had realized that his opponent was now harmless. Its attention had shifted to Sean. Jen was forced to see the boy's death with his own eyes. The creature started walking towards the youngster slowly. Meanwhile, Sean was going crazy due to all the unknown emotions he was feeling at once, but he was doing it in the true sense of the word. He could barely distinguish his fantasies from reality, and he was no longer aware of the real danger. It seemed that only one more drop was needed to make the vase representing his mental sanity overflow, and he didn't have to wait long to see that drop coming. As the creature approached, he remembered how miserable and pathetic his life had been, always targeted by bullies and mistreated by most people, including his father. That's how the world saw him, as a loser, a failure. Until that moment, he had been totally indifferent to it, but now that he seemed to be able to recognize his feelings, remembering his unhappy and unsuccessful life was hurting him. And as the creature approached, he continued to remember all those negative experiences that had previously caused him to feel nothing, but now they were hurting him all at once. This had awakened something in him, a feeling, a power that he had never felt or experienced before. And just before the queen managed to grab the boy, Sean's emotions awakened his Esper powers. He didn't even realize what was happening, but just before the being's claw could touch him, through telekinesis, on pure instinct, and almost reflexively, he was able to violently throw the being against the wall of a building, damaging it, despite it being reinforced concrete, and making it shake. The creature, incredibly surprised, immediately got back into a fighting stance, while Sean, as perplexed as his opponent, was more concerned about his master's condition than trying to understand what was happening. Sean, after remaining silent and motionless, let the being approach him, and then exclaimed,
"Die, bastard!"
unleashing all the anger he had bottled up inside for all those years. Then, he grabbed her by the neck and, thanks to his new powers, made the creature fly into the sky, making her fall again after reaching a height of 15 meters. He smashed her to the ground with such violence that he created a small 3-meter deep crater on the cement floor of the alley, as well as a deafening noise. The tremor generated by the impact was such that the glass of the windows above shattered and fell onto the alley. The beast seemed dead again. Sean no longer seemed to be the same as before. He emitted an aura of anger, as well as confidence and assertiveness, and his face was no longer apathetic and empty, but full of resentment, a resentment towards the whole world, which he poured out against the creature. His voice no longer sounded like that of a boy, but rather like that of a man. Jen, who only realized what was happening at that moment, tried to speak, but the only thing he was able to say was, with a very weak and feeble tone of voice,
Sean.
Mr. Hoffman, I don't know what's happening, but now I'll take you to safety.
Sean replied. Jen then struggled, in inhuman pain, to say,
Sean, she can heal her wounds. You have to hurt her in the brain.
He didn't even have time to finish speaking when the creature was already getting up, while regenerating its wounds, confused about what was happening. Even an irrational being like her wondered how such a brat had suddenly revealed himself to be so powerful as to make it flutter in the air without the slightest effort. She didn't really bother, however, to find an answer, and she prepared for a fierce attack against the boy. She was aware that he was probably way stronger than her, and the panic generated by this awareness drove her to use all its strength in a single blow. A violent run-up began that made the entire alley shake. Now the noises and uproar were more than deafening. They could surely be heard not only outside the alley, but probably also outside the neighborhood. But Sean, with the composure of a war veteran, was not caught off guard in the slightest.
All right, Mr. Hoffman, then I'll make sure that my next move is the one that will decide the battle.
Then Sean used his telekinesis first to abruptly stop the creature's rush, then immobilized it and tried to detach its head from the rest of its body. It seemed as if in the grip, he had put all the negative emotions he had repressed over the years, expressing them in an attitude full of resentment and anger. He leaped forward in front of her, scrutinizing her eyes. After seeing it well, he calmed down a bit.
You're doing all this just to defend your nest, aren't you?
As the being trembled in agony, Sean strengthened his attack even more.
Don't worry. It will all be over soon. I'm sorry if I poured my anger on you.
As a last desperate attempt, the creature tried to free an arm from the boy's grip with success. Then it hit Sean's neck with all its remaining strength, but the result was not what it expected. Instead of breaking his neck, its arm broke. It was as hard as a rock. Moreover, the boy remained completely impassive to the move, not moving an inch and giving no sign of reaction. This time it was that poor mother who understood that her time had come. Sean managed to detach her head as a normal man would do with a thin branch of a tree, after which he literally made it explode into 1,000 pieces that scattered everywhere, definitively decreeing her defeat. All this happened before Jen's incredulous eyes, who could barely realize what had happened. The boy remained motionless, staring into space, while letting his enormous psychic power be noticed by his master. Such power could only belong to a god. Our protagonist was, to say the least, open-mouthed in front of such a spectacle. Slowly, however, his enormous power seemed to vanish from his small body and began to dissolve in the air, until the boy, without making any sound, fainted and fell to the ground. A sudden silence fell on the battlefield, interrupted only by the sound of the wind. He didn't know exactly how long had passed since the end of the battle, but finally, some soldiers arrived, escorted by some high-level members of various sections, who immediately provided assistance. One of them asked, "What the hell happened here?" addressing Jen, who no longer had the strength to respond. He was barely conscious now. Later, both he and Sean were transported on a stretcher to the hospital. Luck had saved him this time, but perhaps the only one he really had to thank was the boy, who had turned out to be, incredibly, a powerful esper. To repay the favor to Sean, he approached his head slightly to the soldier who was carrying him on his stretcher and whispered to him,
I killed that creature and saved the boy.
And then fainted, exhausted from his efforts and wounds.